Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the 9th South-South Forum on Sustainability. The theme is the collapse of modern civilization and the future of humanity. Today, Dr. Jomo will deliver a lecture on worsening world food crisis. We provide English, Chinese, and Spanish simultaneous interpretation. You can find the group of interpretation at the bottom of your computer screen. We would like to thank today's interpreters, Lola Lavender, Anna Torres, Huang Xiaomei, and Li Monghong. May I first introduce the co-moderators for today's section. My name is Sitchoy Jadi Margaret. I am Associate Professor at the Rural Revitalization Strategy Research Institute, Southwest University, China. I am board member of Asian Regional Exchange for New Alternatives and a founding member of Global University for Sustainability. I have been involved in the rural reconstruction movement in China for over 2 decades. Francis Low was professor of politics in University Saint Malaysia, Penang, until his retirement in 2012. Currently, he is senior advisor to the Forum of Federation, Ottawa, and has been conducting workshops on federalism, democracy, and good governance in Burma. Francis is former president of Aliran, a multi-ethnic human rights organization based in Penang. Now I pass the floor to Francis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jade, Margaret Sisui. And it is my great pleasure to be able to, moderate this session. As you know, the focus is on food, and Professor Jomo will be addressing us on this theme of worsening world food crisis. What is behind it all? And then we'll have 2 outstanding commentators, Dr. Vikas RAWAL, who's Professor of Economics at the Center of Economic Studies and Planning at JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. And he'll be followed by also Dr. Lingnan OSSOME, who is Associate Professor of Political Studies at, currently she's in South Africa, in Witwatersrand University, and she specializes in feminist political theory and so on and so forth. I'll introduce them later on. So first of all, I want to introduce Jomo. Jomo Kwame Sundaram, many of you will know already. He already spoke last week on stagflation in this current crisis that we find ourselves in. And he used to be Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development, the United Nations Secretariat, 2005 to 2012, 8 years. And that was followed by a stint as the Assistant Director General of the Food and Agricultural Organization, 2012 to 2015. I had the good fortune to visit Jomo in Rome, when he was Assistant Director General in the FAO. And he took me around to the Colosseum and things like that, places like that. Jomo has authored and edited over 100 books, and besides writing many academic papers and media articles, he regularly writes these media articles, on a weekly basis, commenting on current economic affairs, development affairs. His last one, if I'm not mistaken, was on Sri Lanka, the crisis there. And previously, before the stints with the UN and the FAO, he was professor at the University of Malaya until 2004. And of course, he's also the founder director of a very important NGO in Malaysia called Institute of Social Analysis, INSAN, which unfortunately has gone defunct, and founder chair of IDEAS, International Development Economics Associate. And I think, Vikas might also be involved in that. There's a little conspiracy going on here behind our backs. So anyway, without much further ado, Jomo, the floor is yours. Take from 45 minutes to try to not exceed the hour, and then hopefully then we will be able to have our 2 commentators speak for another 15 minutes each. And after that, maybe we can have some discussion among the 3 presenters. And before we open the floor to, usually there are many questions, both from the chat in English as well as from many people who are listening to us in translation in Chinese. Jomo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Francis, and thank you very much, Jade, and as well as Kinchi, for all your efforts in organizing this series of discussions. We are very much in need of these discussions, and it's precisely for that reason that I'm very grateful to both Vikas RAWAL as well as OSSOME, who will be speaking to us with considerable expertise and also, importantly, considerable experience. OSSOME is involved with Agrarian South and one of the leading alternative journals addressing agrarian and related issues. And Vikas RAWAL has been extremely active and has now is representing the second generation of the leadership of ideas, and perhaps may say something about a conference which is being organized next week, on which I'm sure all of you will be invited to attend. Last week I neglected to thank the interpreters, and I really find this unforgivable on my part, because the essence of successful communication is interpretation, and unfortunately much of what I have to say in a great hurry is often a little bit difficult, and so I'm very grateful. I heard of the translation efforts which were made subsequently, and I'm especially grateful to those who helped with that interpretation of those last week, and I look forward to equally important effort on your part today, especially for our friends in China as well as in Latin America, Spanish America at least. So thank you to our interpreters. Allow me to try to address this question of hunger in a slightly unusual way. I'm going to deal with some of the issues which we face currently, as everybody else in the world seems to be interested in that right now. But I also want to deal with another problem, and that is the problem of what is sometimes called hidden hunger. And when we think about, I think increasingly the discussion about food insecurity has to deal not only with the question of whether or not you get enough calories, which is what is conventionally measured, but also pay far, far more attention to two other issues. So, of course, it is very important whether or not people get enough macronutrients, including both calories as well as protein. But it's also very important, I think, to think about what are called the key elements of so-called hidden hunger, namely micronutrients. Increasingly, as more and more people in the world move from what was called subsistence agriculture to cash crop agriculture, as well as moving from rural to urban areas, we find that much of the homegrown food for people in rural areas, which did not go through the market, but were nonetheless very, very crucial. We find as a consequence that there are incredibly many mineral as well as vitamin deficiencies which plague modern society. And we have a situation where, although people may be better fed in terms of caloric intake and so on, they are very likely to have a more imbalanced diet, lacking in micronutrients. And also, as a consequence of having enough calories and so on, we have the great possibility of increase in what are called food-related or diet-related non-communicable diseases. These are very costly, and I'll show you some estimates in a moment. And they are also, I want to emphasize, very, very widespread. At the turn of the century, the United States was the most obese country in the world. Very shortly thereafter, the president of Coca-Cola in Mexico became the president of Mexico. And he and policies, and very soon, Mexico overtook the United States in terms of the percentage of the population which were obese. And since then, several other Central American countries have become more obese than even Mexico and the United States. This is a real problem, especially for upper middle income countries, and it's something which we should look and pay far greater attention to. Moving on very quickly, I think it's important for us to recognize that there are a whole variety of problems of malnutrition. The questions of not having enough food often result in things like stunting of children, also wasting of children in extreme cases, and a number of other deficiencies. But it's also important to recognize micronutrient deficiencies, which among children have a permanent effect on their lives. And this was brought to my attention that we often think as nutrition problems as not transmissible between generations. And one of the head of the Public Health Foundation in India a few years ago actually educated me on this issue, showing how, in fact, nutrition-related problems, nurture-related problems are actually transmitted from generation to generation. So this puts a special reason why we have to pay far, far more attention to problems of female undernourishment, because that is a huge problem, and it affects the transmission from generation to generation of malnutrition. And these are reasons. So if we look at the world today, there are only 15 countries without any significant problems of malnutrition. All the other countries, over 180 other countries in the world, actually have significant malnutrition problems of one type or another. Now, there are many measures, and I don't want to go through all of them, but as you can see in the screen, we have over 700 million people who are defined as undernourished. I should explain what the FAO means when they say undernourished. It means that they do not get enough calories to reach a certain threshold, which is considered to be the threshold for undernourishment. This threshold is not the amount of dietary energy for people who do hard manual work. It is essentially the threshold for people who lead essentially sedentary lives. So if you have people who do hard manual work, you often find they don't get enough calories, and we often the typical middle class prejudice is to say, oh, these people are poor because they're lazy. In fact, to the contrary, they are lazy. They seem to be lazy precisely because they are undernourished, and often related to that is because they are poor. Now, in the world today, it is estimated that well over 2 billion people suffer from micronutrient deficiencies. There are no reliable numbers because it is not easy to measure micronutrient deficiencies, but the consequences are quite significant. And the consequences of macronutrient undernourishment, particularly calorific undernourishment, reflects itself in stunting, in wasting, in children being underweight, and so on and so forth. Now, it's also important for us to recognize that there are increasing numbers of children, not necessarily only middle-class children, who have become obese. And this has a lot to do with eating problems, with questions consuming an excessive amount of sugar, and so on and so forth. So I think it's important for us to recognize that there are a great number of overweight people in the world, of whom over a third, over 2 billion are overweight, and over a third of them are actually considered obese. Now, let me now deal with the question of the so-called economic cost of malnutrition. I'm an economist, and I have to confess that the economics profession tries to measure and calculate a lot of things. And in fact, there are huge prejudices in measurement, which are important for us to recognize. So for example, if you think about the share of the population, it is estimated right now that malnutrition costs about 5% of world income, of world output. Okay, that is still considered high. But remember that the measurement of malnutrition is often in relation to the incomes of the people concerned. So we are actually overestimating the economic impacts of those who are well-to-do, and we are grossly underestimating the economic impacts among the poor people. So poor people, because their lives are considered to be worth less, etc., we find that this is grossly underestimated. So I think one should recognize that this 5% of GDP number, while it seems high to many people, is in fact an underestimate for a variety of reasons, which I hope will become clear in the course of today's discussion. Now, there are, of course, very important nutrition transitions which have taken place over the last half century, especially. And we have, as I mentioned earlier, more and more people who are urban, more and more people in agriculture who are producing cash crops rather than food crops, and so on and so forth. So there is no simple relationship between the two. And this is part of the reason why a lot of calculations are actually quite misleading. But basically what you see here is a change in the problems of malnutrition, which are identified at the outset, so much so that malnutrition has become, the emphasis now is less on calorific undernourishment, but much more on other elements, which I mentioned earlier. Now, let me go back to the question of hidden hunger. What do we mean by hidden hunger? What do we mean by micronutrient deficiencies? Well, there are basically three types of micronutrients: vitamins, minerals, and what are called trace elements for those of you who are biochemically inclined. And what is recommended today is dietary diversity. Okay, so and this really is the kind of sustainable food system solution we should be aiming for, not a food system solution which is basically dictated by the lords of the universe who meet at Davos once a year, or their friends. Unfortunately, this is the emphasis which has been placed by last year's conference on food system reform, which unfortunately was a huge opportunity which was wasted because Davos basically defined the agenda for discussion, and and this was very unfortunate. So we need to begin to think also that and recognize that often the solutions by well-meaning people such as UNICEF is for nutrition supplements. But I want to emphasize that if you go down into actually measuring the cost of nutrition supplements, they are in fact a very costly solution. So what we need, what are some of the low-cost options? There are simple low-cost options. Most importantly, we need to recognize the interrelationship between soil nutrition, plant nutrition, and human nutrition. That is fairly obvious, particularly for the consumption of vegetables and fruits. But in addition, I think there are low-cost solutions, such as there's the iodization of table salt and a number of other options where we can compensate for deficiencies. For example, in Anatolia, in central Turkey, there is a zinc deficit in the soil. So it is important, for example, to try to include that in the fertilizer which might be used. But I want to emphasize that the solutions do not rest in what are called bioengineering options, but rather they are in agroecology. And unfortunately, very little research goes into agroecological options, partly because it's not something which corporations stand to gain very much on. Now, I'm going to go through a lot of slides just to give you an idea. So I'm not going to discuss every slide very carefully, but this gives you an idea of how much hidden hunger there is in the world. And you will find, of course, that much of the hidden hunger is to be found in the developing countries, not surprisingly. Now, moving on very quickly, I think I want to emphasize the huge burden of child and maternal malnutrition. And of course, maternal malnutrition is an especially serious problem because it transmits malnutrition from generation to generation. So this is a particularly important area for intervention. And unfortunately, there are no serious efforts at the international level to try to address this. At the national level, at the subnational levels, there are often some initiatives. Relatively poorer countries, Brazil, for example, when they were addressing Fome Zero, the attempt to try to eradicate hunger in Brazil, also began to address the question of child and maternal malnutrition through specific interventions related to Bolsa Familia. In China, I had the honor of talking to after the Beijing Olympics, and then President Hu Jintao gave one of the athletes buildings to the International Poverty Center, which was set up in Beijing, which is different from the International Poverty Center set up by the UNDP in Brazil at that time, which no longer exists, by the way. But the International Poverty Center set up in Beijing started off with this, and it began to do a lot of interesting research, and I was slightly involved, peripherally involved in some of this work. And you could see how right from the outset, they were already beginning to address these questions. So it was not just a question of growing enough food, but also thinking about the kinds of food which should be grown to compensate. So for example, in some of the remote areas in inland China, there are serious iron deficiencies. And so what we find is that red spinach, which has a especially high content of iron. Spinach obviously has high content, but red spinach in particular has a especially high content. These were introduced and promoted to try to address some of these problems. Now, moving on very quickly, I think it is important to recognize that anemia is actually a very serious problem, and there has been a little bit of progress suggested by available data. I want to emphasize available data because there isn't much data available, but the progress seems to be gradual rather than dramatic. Vitamin A deficiencies are also very widespread, and this, of course, has to do with visual problems and sight problems, and very often, if neglected, can lead to permanent loss of sight. So these are all very, very serious problems, but we are making relatively slow progress in the world today. Yet another problem, as I mentioned earlier, is the question of iodine, and this has been addressed partially by having iodized salt, and this is a simple solution which actually has been quite successful in many parts of the world. But let's face it, very few countries in the developing world actually use and promote iodized salt, and this is a very unfortunate problem. Now, the third problem, as I highlighted earlier, relating to malnutrition, is the whole question of food-related or diet-related non-communicable diseases. And this basically, a non-communicable disease, as its name implies, is non-infectious. Okay, so there are many non-communicable diseases. Smoking is non-communicable in theory, although of course, if you're in the room with a smoker, you're probably likely to be exposed to secondary smoking, and this is problematic. There's occupational safety issues and so on. But the vast majority of non-communicable diseases which we need to deal with today are actually food or diet related. And this is where there is great room for intervention. And and of course, many people, when they think about NCDs, food-related NCDs, they think about obesity, they think about people who are overweight. And this is, of course, important. But in fact, you can be underweight and yet suffer from diabetes, for example, because of excessive sugar consumption. There are many factors which influence overweightness and obesity, and it's very superficial to think that the problem of NCDs is really expressed solely in terms of weight problems. So and I think it is very wrong to refer to weight problems, overweightness and obesity as overnutrition. There's no such thing as overnutrition. If you consume too much of a particular particular vitamin, for example, it is usually expelled without any problems from the human body. For example, if you take too much vitamin C. So, for those of you who are vitamin C believers, taking vitamin C is not going to result in you being overnourished or anything like that. So it's very important for us to think about this. And when we think about the economic cost of obesity, something called the McKinsey Global Institute. This McKinsey & Company is one of the leading consultants in the world, and they have something called the McKinsey Global Institute, which does research. And we find that the economic cost of armed conflict at that time, when it was estimated in 2014, was 2.1 trillion. Okay, not in the middle of any war, but it was 2.1 trillion. Smoking was also about almost 2.1 trillion. Yeah? That means 1,000 billion. Okay, this is an American trillion, not a British trillion. And then you have obesity, which costs, it was estimated costs about 2 trillion. Okay, so obesity obviously is diet related, but there are also other problems which are not for which nobody has made estimates, which are also diet related, which people need to deal with. So when we think about this problem, we have to recognize, as I suggested earlier, that we have the problem of overweight and obesity continues to grow, especially in the developing world. Some people say that it is genetically determined. For example, you have higher bone density among people in Oceania and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, there is grounds for concern that there is a serious problem of overweightedness as well as obesity. And as Popkin, I think, has recently shown, many of these problems are relate to human metabolism. Now, I'm going to have a series of slides just showing you how serious the problem is, particularly in the Asian area. I presume that many of the people in the audience are from this part of the world, so that's why I focused on this. But there are equally, if not more, alarming figures for Latin America as well as for Africa. Unfortunately, the figures are least available for African countries, but nonetheless, whatever is available is no cause for comfort. Now, likewise with overweightedness among children, it's a serious growing problem in Asia, and South Asian adult obesity is growing in all the countries of South Asia as well. Now, how do we go about improving human nutrition? Okay, obviously you need a better food system, and the food system should prioritize human well-being rather than the sale of food commodities. And a lot of problems today have to do with the fact of food processing. Food processing depriving many of the micronutrients, taking away many of the micronutrients from naturally available foods on the one hand, and also the nature of food processing, addition of a lot of salt, addition of sugar, and there is an increasing amount of sugar being introduced in food in countries like my own in Malaysia, and I believe in many other parts of the world as well. And of course, the increasing resort to deep frying. Deep frying is so you buy prepared food, and deep frying is the best way to hide the fact that food is not fresh. Because when you deep fry, and often the nature of deep frying is such that you keep on using oil until it is completely absorbed by the food. And so you have the problems of rancid oil and a number of other problems relating to this. So what we need to think about is sustainable food systems, which actually introduce different types of incentives. But this, of course, is the big question. How do you do that in a system which is supposed to be a market system, which does not have much emphasis on regulation? And especially in developing countries, this is much, much more difficult. Then you have to deal with the problem of advertising and the promotion of new types of food cultures, where people are increasingly resorting to food which is not particularly healthy. So I think it's very important for us to recognize that also on the question of the right to food, it is important to think of the social protection floor, which more and more people in the world are thinking about, to extend it to the right to food. And this, I think, is a very fundamental achievement. Many people seem to think that the World Bank's idea of cash transfers is such a wonderful solution. You leave a choice in the hands of the consumer and so on and so forth. In fact, as the evidence from India with the public food system, public distribution system of food, you find that actually mothers especially much prefer transfers in kind of food rather than transfers of cash, which can be abused by the male heads of households and so on. But also it results in, the evidence seems to suggest that it results in far better nutrition outcomes as a consequence. So you basically have very serious new problems which we need to think about. And you can see the fastest growing part of Asia, East Asia, has this huge range of problems which are captured by this bar chart. Now, moving, the solution obviously lies in more and more varied food. So diversity of diets is really quite crucial. But diversity is much, much more unaffordable. When you had people growing their food around the house in the countryside, it was very possible to have dietary diversity. But when you have an increasingly market-oriented system, you skimp. You try to skip some things which are quite expensive in favor of cheaper things and so on and so forth. So the result is that you actually, the progression is towards a lowest common denominator rather than a better mean. And this is reflected in some of these charts as well. So another issue, of course, is the fact that in the 21st century, since the beginning of the early 21st century, with the progress of financialization, you have much, much more commodity speculation. Okay? Commodity speculation. And the result of this is that you have commodity price increases, which have got little to do with actual supply and demand situations. And this became a very serious problem around 2007, 2008, particularly after the advent of what is called indexing. You have a commodity price indices, and you speculate on them, and you rely on algorithms to transfer from one type of investment into another, and so on and so forth. So this resulted in a huge increase in the price in food prices around 2007, 2008. There was another problem, of course, which I'll try to come back to later, involving Chinese rice output. Now, what we have to recognize, however, is that in Asia, there has been a decline of undernourishment. So just to explain these two acronyms, POU refers to the prevalence of undernourishment. That means the share of the population which is undernourished. And as I said earlier, undernourished is narrowly defined in terms of whether or not you have enough calories. So the combination of the Green Revolution and the fact that you have huge exports of wheat and other products from places like the United States, Canada, and Russia and Ukraine has resulted in a big increase in the prevalence of undernutrition. And then the NOU refers to the number of undernourished people. So the numbers have also gone down slightly, And although they seem to have gone up in recent years, I didn't put the latest figures here, but the FAO figures, which Vikas knows much better than I, suggest that the situation is actually has been getting worse. So there has been a decline of hunger in the Asia Pacific. In fact, in most regions of the world, there has been a decline, except in Africa. Okay, and the situation in Africa, unfortunately, is very alarming, even without episodes. And this is without even considering, for example, what climate change is doing. Global warming, besides its direct effect of making it much more difficult to grow crops to maturity and to reduce water supplies, it also has the effects of certain phenomena which are particularly peculiar to the tropics. And I'm referring, of course, to El Nino, where you have droughts and severe droughts at that for extended periods of time. And then you have La Nina, the increase in flooding, in rainfall, as well as in flooding in many parts of the world. So you have both types of problems which are not conducive to crop production. And then with the rising water level, you find, for example, in Vietnam, in Bangladesh, more and more seawater is actually seeping in to rice fields. So rice production is actually going down. There is, of course, there has been some research, especially in China, on growing rice in saline water. And this may well be the only solution, because there isn't enough determination in the world to try to stem the global warming problems thus far. And this is worse now with the war in the Ukraine. So yes, in Asia Pacific, we have declining hunger, and in the rest of the world as well. But I think it's uneven in the Asia Pacific region. And I want to emphasize that the problem is much more, has unfortunately not been mitigated in Africa. Now, there are a lot of numbers here which you don't have time to go through, but basically they show stunting, underweightness, wasting, and so on. I'm sorry for the typographical error here. And then you can see that child undernutrition in terms of macronutrients earlier has been declining, but only slowly. And it's important to recognize that there's also been progress for both boys and girls in this region. But these general figures for the continent, which or a region which contains more than 60% of the world's population, actually obscures as much as it reveals. And so while we take comfort in the fact that Asia seems to be doing well, we have to recognize that just like with poverty, much of the poverty reduction over the recent period is actually accounted for by China's significant progress in terms of poverty reduction. So the ratio of stunting rates, the disparity between the richest and the poorest quintiles is actually quite serious. Okay, and I don't have time to go to explain all the measures here, but you can imagine. You can take my word for it, if you will. And there are some progress in terms of the wasting in the Asia Pacific region as well, which I think we need to acknowledge. And there has been some increase in production of food, of agricultural output in the Asia Pacific region. But you should notice that the big emphasis is not on food production, is on agricultural production. And so where the choice has been, where cash crop production is much more lucrative, farmers actually turn to cash crop production. Now, many studies have shown, for example, that in fact, just like with the working class patterns, you have what is called a moral economy among farmers as well, where farmers, even if they are doing cash crop production, they actually continue to produce some of the food crops. But of course, that is not an option for people who are in urban areas and so on and so forth. So this, I think, is important to recognize. In Malaysia, for example, those who produce rubber or palm oil they are also producing, they also grow a few fruit crops and fruit trees around the household. Now, let me move on to address some of the issues. I think many people talk about sustainable agriculture, and this is a term which is bandied around very, very loosely. I want to suggest to you that the only options are nature-based solutions, agroecology. Unfortunately, there are no other options. And this is what, these non-options is what is being touted, particularly by organizations which may mean well, but are doing a lot of damage. The Rockefeller Foundation through the Agricultural Development Council in the past, and more recently, of course, Bill Gates is the major promoter of genetic engineering and greater reliance on agrochemicals. There are a whole range of problems which I think are going to emerge and which we need to think about as well. So once we get over the short-term problems of the current food price increases and so on and so forth, and food shortages, we really need to begin to think very, very seriously about many of these other options. In fact, I would say that that perhaps many of these solutions might well be better introduced in this period of adversity when supply chains are being greatly disrupted. So you have, of course, hunger being associated with inadequate calorific consumption, and it's often said that it is due to that the big problem in the world today is that there's not enough food being produced. This is in fact a lie. It is a lie. It is not that there is not enough food in the world to produce in the world, but the fact is that many people cannot afford to get the food they need. They just cannot afford to do so because of the higher cost of food and their low incomes. So this is the big problem in the world. This was admitted by even a right-wing former deputy USTR, Josette Sheeran, when she was head of the World Food Program. And you know, so I think it is important to recognize that it is not a question of not enough food production, but it's also important to recognize that food production is under siege. It's heavily constrained by a whole variety of problems, and the fact that there is not enough research being done and not enough extension work, which has been rather neglected to promote nature-based solutions. So we need to think much more seriously about, for example, food losses during the process of production and what is called food waste in the process of consumption. Okay, so food losses involve the fact that, for example, many farmers, especially poor farmers, lose a lot of food to pests, including birds and so on and so forth. At one time in the 1950s, for example, Mao Zedong actually had a campaign to kill sparrows because sparrows were taking a lot of grain. But later on, by killing sparrows, you realize that you have also killed the natural predators of certain insects, which then cause problems. So it is important to recognize the ecological balances which are important in society. So during the Green Revolution in rice production, for example, there was a significant introduction of pesticides. These pesticides killed a lot of pests, but these included the natural predators of the so-called brown hopper. And the elimination of these natural predators meant the brown hopper could proliferate. And in 2007 or 2008, there was a huge brown hopper resurgence in China, and it wiped out 20% of the Chinese rice harvest for that year. Okay, and that basically, and China sent people to the International Rice Research Institute, which used to have a department of entomology looking at insects and so on, which had more than 200 people. When the Chinese team arrived, there were 6 people left. 1 Malaysian scientist, entomologist, and 5 lab assistants. That was the situation in 2008 when that team got there. You know, I cannot vouch for it. I was not there, but you can read about it in the New York Times, which carried an article on this story. So the underfunding of research by governments, the underfunding of research even for intergovernmental organizations, basically is part of the problem. And then you have a lot of waste in consumption. In the West, for example, in many rich countries, there are sell-by dates. If you don't sell the food by a certain date, that food has to be thrown away, and so on. Of course, supermarkets and others resort to all kinds of tactics to try to avoid wasting that food. But nonetheless, these are serious problems. So we find that of the food which is produced, almost a third, at least 30%, is lost. And of the food which is available for consumption, another third of the food which is available for consumption is lost. So you can imagine how much food is lost as a consequence of this. This is a lot of food lost as well as wastage. Okay? So the word losses is used to losses in production and storage, etc. And wastage refers to losses at the level of consumption. So if you keep your food too long and you throw it out, that is basically considered waste rather than losses. Now, that's a simple definition of issues, not any great scientific insight. Now, what has happened is that while once upon a time governments played a major role, we find that increasingly governments have taken a step backwards, and increasingly it is private initiatives which rule. So you have, for example, some agricultural extension, but who's doing this agricultural extension? It is not government agricultural agencies. They are private companies who are trying to get farmers hooked on their products, whether it is fertilizers, whether it's pesticides, or new seeds, and so on and so forth. This is basically what is happening in the world today. And usually they use all the modern techniques, the so-called influencers, and so on and so forth to promote their products. Likewise, you also find that there has been some improvement of infrastructure, and this has been important. There are some improvements in farmers' practices, but some of the most important ways in promoting desirable farmer practices have basically been avoided. The person who, for example, did the PhD research which identified the brown hopper problem I spoke about earlier, he basically, Peter Kenmore, he basically promoted the idea of farmer field schools. And this was successfully introduced in Indonesia and then promoted in many other parts of the world with varying degrees of success. But the point is that, you know, peer learning is much more important when you think about it. Farmers are prepared to learn from other farmers who can speak their language, who understand their level of knowledge, and so on and so forth, rather than somebody giving a more technically reliable presentation using some of the new methods, which, for example, Bill Gates has been promoting through his various initiatives. So you find that there are very few campaigns to try to address some of the losses as well, and there are more campaigns to try to reduce food waste, and these of course are quite well-meaning, but the campaigns to reverse malnutrition, unfortunately, are few and far between. Now, I'll skip this. I'll just quickly mention 2 or 3 things. One can actually have a very good diet on basically a plant-based diet. Okay, I'm not a vegan by any means, but I think it's important to establish that. And one can also get good protein and calcium from milk, but one can also get calcium and protein from other sources. And it's not as if milk is the only requirement. So this attempts to suggest that milk is the only source of protein and milk and calcium which can be a substitute for mother's milk, is misleading, because it is not a substitute of an adequate substitute for mother's milk, nor is it really affordable for people who most need it. So we find, as I mentioned earlier, an increasing promotion of consumption of all kinds of things which are not good for you, and also slowing food supply growth in many countries before the pandemic. Okay, now we don't have the new figures since the pandemic. We just have estimates, but the suggestion seems to be that even if production continued, we find that there are greater and greater problems of supply lines, and this has made the problem far more serious. So food losses and waste by region is summed up for the world here. And as you can see, the greatest amount of waste is actually in the rich countries. Okay, what I call the North here. Okay, this is a pattern which is fairly generalizable. Although, of course, I think it must be acknowledged that there are important differences. Much greater waste in countries such as the United States and Britain, much less waste in some of the other countries and so on, in Italy and so on. So let me move on very quickly to recognizing that there is, as I said earlier, a great amount of losses at the point of production, as well as storage and transport, and this is a problem in Asia as well. In India, in China, it is still a very, very serious problem. And in the Philippines, it seems to be a serious problem. But I would put it to you that some of these figures perhaps are misleading. Yeah? Now, let me move. Now, one of the key questions many people ask is, can we continue to increase food production? And in fact, the big challenge, of course, is climate. But the whole question of sustainable agriculture should not be reduced to simply dealing with climate change. There are a whole range of other problems. And as I said, that in sustainable agriculture basically involves variations of agroecology and ultimately nature-based solutions and so on. This doesn't mean there's no room for artificial production of, say, fertilizers and so on. As I suggested earlier, for example, this was very important in many parts of the world. But I think we need to begin to think about some of these problems in a very hard-nosed way. The people who are promoting agroecology have not come up with adequate solutions to many of the problems agroecology faces, and there is no inclination on the part of governments to do much more research. And of course, understandably, the private sector is not interested unless they can increase dependency on their purported solutions. So moving on very quickly, I think it's important also to recognize that food price increases in Asia have been quite considerable. And most alarmingly, food price increases have been greatest for vegetables. Okay? And this is very, very important, because it is vegetables which have been so important in balancing diets, and it is the loss of vegetables or reduction of vegetables in human diets, which is a major problem today, in my view. So coming back to the question of undernourishment, we've already talked about inadequate dietary energy. We have the measures in terms of the so-called prevalence of undernourishment. We have the number of undernourished and so on. And generally, we have relatively slow progress. And I want to highlight what seems to be the recent trend. Okay, if you go and read the World Bank numbers on poverty, poverty has been declining from year to year, every year, at least until the pandemic. Okay. Now, when you look at the numbers, however, on undernourishment, on dietary energy consumption, you actually find that the shortfall, which then has become the main measure of food insecurity, the prevalence of undernourishment, has actually increased the number of undernourished and even the prevalence of undernourishment has increased since the middle of the last decade. We're not quite a decade yet, but since the middle of the last decade. So this is a major source of concern. So in other words, the earlier progress is linked to this. And this basically raises the question of why there is this disparity between food undernourishment, between poverty and food insecurity. This disparity is important for us to recognize, because what are you measuring with poverty? Because when you look at the breakdown of the measure of the so-called poverty line, the poverty line, more than 60% of the poverty line is supposed to be from food. Okay, it's accounted for by food, and yet you have people who are more and more food insecure, despite your apparent decline in your poverty line. So there is some great disparity there, and basically, I think we have to look at our poverty numbers much more critically as an indicator of well-being. So these are some figures as far as undernourishment is concerned in the last decade and a half. And I want to emphasize the point I made earlier that women and girls are generally much hungrier because of the internal dynamics in the household. But also I want to emphasize because of the increasing commoditization of food, and therefore the women as food providers have diminished in family dynamics, and this I think has diminished, has also reflected in this measures. Now let me move to the present situation, because everybody is quite interested in this, and I want to emphasize many of the problems which we were talking about earlier, but I particularly want to emphasize that as with the structural adjustment programs of the 1980s, more recently, especially since the beginning of the last decade, the mantra coming from the West, okay, from the Washington Consensus, but also from others, has been that fiscal austerity is the thing to do. So if you already owe a lot of money, just cut spending, spend less, and so on and so forth. That has been the mantra coming from the West. So it does not lend itself to any medium as well as long-term solutions to some of the problems which we were talking about earlier. Now, the situation has been worse, in my view, but in the last 8 years or so, when Obama basically began his so-called pivot to Asia and began the new Cold War. So we have seen since then, with the pandemic, an increasing number of supply disruptions. And of course, when Trump and Abe were president and prime minister respectively, both Trump and Abe were basically calling for a reshoring of foreign direct investment. So so those countries in East Asia and elsewhere, which were heavily reliant on foreign direct investment, therefore they became very, very vulnerable. Their growth was adversely affected, and all this happened, I want to emphasize, even before the pandemic. Yeah, Trump and Abe happened before the pandemic. The pandemic, of course, made things worse. The refusal of the rich countries to make any serious concessions in terms of the TRIPS waiver, lowering the cost of access to therapies, medicines, etc., etc., only made things worse. And then we have a situation where, with the recent Russian invasion of Ukraine and the response in terms of sanctions. What is sanctions? It is the deliberate cutting off of disruption of supply chains, whether you like it or not. That is essentially it. It is an ancient form of laying economic siege. Okay, and this obviously has affected wheat supplies and fertilizer supplies to many parts of the world. I used to say to Asia and Africa, but recently I learned that even Latin America is being very badly affected by the supply, the disruption of supplies of fertilizer from Russia as well as from Belarus. Now, then of course we have a situation now where the situation which prevailed for about the last decade, the so-called unconventional monetary policies and so on, cannot really hold anymore. And so you have some pressure and interest rates have begun to go up. And so once the US raises interest rates and Chairman Powell, I think tomorrow, interest rates will go up 75 basis points, which is a huge jump. Okay, so as a consequence of that, you have, on the one hand, a slowing of the world economy due to the factors which I described earlier. And at the same time, you have inflation because of the supply side, what I call supply side cuts. Now, so this combination is what a phenomenon which happened in the 1970s, which is called stagflation, stagnation as well as inflation. And this, of course, is reflected most the inflation of food price in food prices and greater food insecurity, particularly in the global south. So this is a very, very major problem, but most tragically, it is a deliberate policy. These are due to deliberate policies. You cannot say that sanctions are an act of God. You cannot blame it on nature. You cannot blame it on something else like as you might want to do in the case of the pandemic. It is deliberate, and this is and they were only prepared to make an exception as far as energy because of the heavy European reliance on energy. So there's almost a racist element to this, because you are basically affecting supplies to the rest of the world. So it's a very, very serious problem, which I don't want to exaggerate, but I think we are now in a situation where we need to begin to think about the relationship of things which are non-economic. The whole question of peace, the whole question of non-alignment, the question of what you do in this kind of situation is not a straightforward issue, but I think it is extremely important that we begin to think about ways and means by which we can try to get out of these kinds of problems together. And I think this is where I think the Global South, speaking as one, particularly in upholding the principles of non-alignment once again, not the kind of non-alignment which Tito, for example, and others, Sukarno and Nkrumah and others began in 1961 in Belgrade, but it's a non-alignment of a different type for our times. Because let's face it, capitalism seems to be the only show in town, and so you need to begin to think about kinds of arrangements which do not further impoverish and starve people, the vast majority of people in developing countries. So let me stop here and thank you very much for your attention. I hope I was not too fast for the interpreters, but I think some of you may find some of this interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jomo, for very comprehensive, big overview. I think a lot of people expected you to zero in on the current food crisis, so to speak, but actually you gave us this background to all, what's happening. It's so simple to understand what's happening, but all the other various aspects. So now I want to invite our next speaker to comment on what Jomo has already shared with us. Professor Vikas RAWAL is a professor of economics at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. And his research has always focused on issues related to agriculture and agrarian relations. And his recent books include The Global Economy of Pulses, published by the FAO, and another book called When Governments Fail, both co-edited. And he's convening an ideas conference, which Jomo mentioned just now. It's online conference. Part of it, some people are coming to KL, isn't it? But it's also online, and they will share with us about the conference later on. Over to you, Vikas. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis, and thank you, Jomo, for this very interesting overview that you gave of the problems that the world of agriculture and food faces today. I would take the cue from Francis and focus on the current food crisis, show you some numbers which essentially take the story forward from what Jomo showed and raise some issues that I think have become quite important in the current context. So let me just quickly share the screen and I will show you just two graphs. This graph, it shows the number of undernourished person. Jomo had shown us the figures for a few years. This shows you a somewhat longer trend.
Wow.
And what I want to show you, what I want you to sort of focus on is the fact that in the recent years, there has been a very sharp increase in the number of people who face chronic hunger. It's gone up from 642 million people here to 776. That's the global estimate of number of undernourished persons. I would also like you to note that if you look at this trend, there is a distinct sort of shift in weight of sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Asia in the total burden of hunger that these two regions in the world sort of account for. South Asia, of which India is the big part, accounts for about 300 million people alone. I mean, this region alone accounts for about 300 million people facing chronic undernourishment. So this really is the present context. I would like to show you one more graph. This graph shows you estimates of number of people who face moderate to severe levels of food insecurity. This is based on a new method of estimating food insecurity, something that was in fact started when Jomo headed the Department of Economic and Social Development at the FAO. And I think it's been an extremely important initiative, which is going to have, which is important for our understanding of the nature of food insecurity in the world. Once again, this graph shows you that over the last few years, there's been a very sharp rise in levels of food insecurity in the world. Again, the big bulk of this rise, about 2.4 billion people face moderate to severe food insecurity in the world, of which about 2/3 are in sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Asia. So, you know, these two parts of the world, South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, are really the hunger and food insecurity hotspots of the world. So that's one point I would like to make. Now, coming to the nature of crisis, I would like to sort of frame this problem, that is the current crisis, in sort of two sets of issues. One is, what are the causes of the current food crisis? And before one gets into the details of this, I think there are three sets of issues that are being discussed. These issues have been important for some time now. These issues have come to the fore in the context of the COVID crisis and in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war. But I would club the determinants of hunger and food insecurity in the contemporary world into three sets of issues. One is the wars and the conflicts. The second is the climate change. But the third is the larger structural issues related to the economic conditions of people. So, you know, conditions of food production and distribution, conditions of affordability, incomes, whether people can afford food, things that are related to the economic conditions in these countries, which are both related to how agriculture has developed, but also how these economies have developed or remained underdeveloped. Now, I think of these three issues, I think, and this is a problem that has been there for a while, but it is a problem that you also see in the narratives about the contemporary food crisis, which is that an excessive emphasis is being placed on things like wars and conflicts, and in the contemporary context on the Russia-Ukraine war, and on things like climate change. Not that these are not important, not that these have not exacerbated the economic crisis. Indeed, the global food crisis, indeed they have, and they have done so very significantly. But the problem is that the more fundamental causes, the globalization and its discontents, as Jomo referred to in his presentation, and how they have weakened both the availability of food and the access of food. That is, capacity of people to buy food, the food becoming unaffordable for a large number of people. That has a problem, that as being an important determinant of why we have hunger and food insecurity is often underplayed in narratives of many international organizations. So this is a point that I would like to place on the table, that if you're looking at determinants of food insecurity, you're talking of these three sets of things: the economic underdevelopment, the lack of incomes, lack of employment, lack of purchasing power, the wars and conflicts, and issues related to climate change and extreme climatic events. Now, the point is that also one needs to understand that very often wars and conflicts and the capacity to deal with extreme events and climate change are undermined because of economic underdevelopment. So I would like to sort of point out that we need to understand that for a lot of people, hunger and food insecurity are related to their inability to buy food, and that is related to the fact that the levels of incomes are very low, the levels of economic development are very low. The second thing that has become important is that over the last few decades, when the world of agriculture and food production has become increasingly globalized, and a lot of less developed countries, both underdeveloped and developing countries, have become increasingly import dependent, both for certain food commodities as well as for agricultural inputs. If you look at India, for example, our dependence on edible oils has increased for something like 20%, in 20-25% 3 decades ago, to over 70% now. So over 70% of edible oils are imported. So if Indonesia puts a restriction on exports of palm oil, it creates a huge crisis in a large importing country like India. And it's not like overnight you can either find alternative suppliers of these commodities or make your farmers produce them. Similarly, we have the situation with agricultural inputs, fertilizers, and the crisis related to fertilizers has become extremely sort of serious in the wake of the Russia-Ukraine war, because Russia and Ukraine are the biggest suppliers of potash. They are also important suppliers of natural gas, which goes into making of urea. But this problem is not, once again, related only to Russia and Ukraine. It's a problem that has been building up post-COVID pandemic as countries have restricted their exports of these commodities to protect the domestic supply. And China is one of those countries. China is a major supplier of phosphate fertilizers. China is a major supplier of urea, and China has restricted exports to ensure that the domestic supply is not, there's no problem of domestic supply. It has also done so in the wake of the energy crisis that China was facing. So, the fact that a lot of less developed countries have become increasingly dependent on imports. And India is an interesting case in this, because it's a large country, our requirements are large, there is a certain inflexibility in terms of our requirement. When there is sowing season, you need fertilizer, there's nothing you can do. You just have to, you are a complete price taker. You have to go and buy it at whatever price you get, has resulted in a situation where you are vulnerable to crisis of this kind. So the vulnerability in the world food system created because of this increased dependence on imports is something that less developed countries are actually facing very seriously. And this has come to the fore in the recent years, in particular in the wake of the COVID pandemic and the Russia-Ukraine war. Now, coming to my last point, and I think this is an extremely important point, that when we look at solutions, very often agroecology is presented as a sort of catch-all phrase to refer to anything and everything. And I think there is a problem here. If you're looking for problems of agriculture in the world today, and if our experience of last 50 years is anything to go by, what we know is that the problems of agriculture can only be solved through science-based solutions. And when I say science-based solutions, it is not necessarily an antithesis of nature-based solutions. But it is antithesis of unscientific solutions, which are often promoted in the name of agroecology. So in India, cow dung and cow urine are apparently the pesticides that can cure everything, just as they were at some point promoted as cures for even COVID. Okay, similarly, all kinds of bogus science is promoted in name of it being more nature-based. On the other hand, a lot of scientific developments, which are actually nature-based, are promoted as not being nature, are sort of being discarded as not being nature-based. So I think the question of what is nature-based and what is not nature-based is different from what is rooted in good science and what is not rooted in good science. The other important thing to understand is that the science does not necessarily mean control of corporations. In fact, if there is any evidence to the contrary, it is provided by agriculture, where the biggest scientific advance has come through public systems of technological work. Whether it is under the framework of CGIAR systems or under the framework of national agricultural research systems. And this has happened across the continents, including, everywhere from China to Latin America. Country after country presents an example of successes of public sector agricultural research in making huge advances in production and productivity. And I think this is extremely important. So it's important not to think that science-based solutions are necessarily solutions that are going to be controlled by big corporations. That's not the case at all. It has indeed happened that a lot of scientific advance in the recent years has been captured by the big agribusiness corporations. But does not necessarily have to be the case. And I think it's important to differentiate between the importance of science-based solutions from one's opposition to the control of agribusiness corporations, the big business, on the resources of the world, on the food systems. Now, I think that indeed is, as Jomo quite rightly pointed out, the core of the problem that we face today. In fact, if you look at the data on prices, the speculation in food prices is causing the food price inflation much more than the supply issues. There are supply bottlenecks, but the price rises that have happened in different parts of the world are much more than what would be warranted because of shortages of supply. And as Jomo pointed out, was the case in the previous sort of episodes of high food price rises. This has been related to the whole system of futures trading that has been created, the whole system of speculation on food, on futures prices that has been created in the recent years in different parts of the world. So, a lot of problems that we face today, I would like to argue, are rooted in the policies of globalization and neoliberalism, are rooted in the economic policies that have been sort of imposed by the North on the countries in the global South. And I think it is the answer to the kind of crisis we face today lies in reversal of those policies, lies in ensuring that at least large countries, South Asia, or countries in sub-Saharan Africa become more and more self-sufficient in production of key agricultural inputs and become more and more self-sufficient in production of key agricultural outputs. Now that, I think, is at the core of it, and I think one really needs to look in that direction. And in my view, the pathway to get there lies in one, these countries being able to establish their sovereign right on their policy making, taking advantages of solutions like the non-aligned sort of alliances between, among the global South, as well as in using that then to seek science-based solutions, which are both rooted in good science, but also good for sustainability of agriculture and food system. So sustainability of agriculture and food systems requires science-based solutions. What Jomo called nature-based solutions, in fact, must also be science-based solutions. And it's important not to think of these two as being antitheses of each other. They, in fact, are not. And the solution lies in doing good science. Solution lies in finding scientific solutions that are sustainable. And solution lies in countries of the global South being able to promote such solutions for their own good. So that's, I think, the set of points that I would like to make.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Vikas, also keeping it, your comments to that 15 minutes framework. So let's move on to Lynn OSSOME, and she is she comes to us from Kenya originally, but now she's based in South Africa, and she's Associate Professor of Political Studies with specialization in the fields of feminist political economy, feminist political theory, and her research interest is in gendered labor, land, and agrarian question, the modern state and political economy of gendered violence. Now she was also once a visiting professor at Yale University, and she's, like Jomo mentioned earlier on, very important editorial board member of Agrarian South, the Journal of Political Economy, and co-editor of the Journal of Contemporary African Studies, and also a board member of the CODESRIA, the Council for Development of Social Science Research in Africa. Lynn, over to you.
Thank you, Francis, and thanks for this invitation to join you. I wanted to frame my contribution around the social infrastructure, or the social substratum, which is quite linked to processes of social reproduction, and which I think is fairly neglected in our discussions of food. And I think Jomo highlighted already many dimensions of this social question, so I appreciate this. I'll talk about 5 broad framings for thinking about this. First is to highlight the neglect of the social costs. There's a social cost of these micronutrient deficiencies, of malnutrition. And especially if we think of this cost in view of the fact that most of the standard measures of economic success, whether you're talking of GDP growth rates, whether you're talking of capital inflows or trade value, fail to recognize different non-market or non-monetized values. And so what we have is really a misreading or very misleading national efforts to redress hunger and to redress poverty. So as we are seeing in many African countries, we've seen this, for well, not many, but in a number of African countries, including South Africa here, where I am, growth in real GDP, which has had very little impact on food security and the nutrition levels of populations. In fact, what we are seeing is a general decrease in per capita availability, as well as consumption of food grains. And we are seeing very prevalent hunger in many parts of the continent. And I think what these statistics and other similar statistics suggest, one is the need for a fuller consideration of the extensive social and economic infrastructure. We can't talk about, and I think both Jomo and Vikas have talked about this, we cannot think of this food question purely in economistic terms. So we need to give fuller consideration to this. There's a fairly extensive social infrastructure that is required to move beyond consistent inequality in food and nutrition access. And one, I think, is that even micro level interventions, which are aimed at improving household income and consumption, even these interventions may actually be, they may be ineffective if they do not account for other factors which determine intra-household distribution. So for instance, this is a trend that, I think has specific expressions, but generally those who are most hungry and most malnourished are also generally more likely to be additionally dependent on some kind of access to land, to nature, to the commons, in addition to wages, right? So for them, in order for them to be able to meet their minimum daily consumption needs, they also have to have access to all these other things. So there's no, in a sense, direct way of intervening into filling this nutritional gaps without thinking of the broader infrastructure. And such households may also be making pragmatic decisions, which are around livelihood, are around distributional strategies. And a lot of the strategies may actually alter intra-household consumption patterns in ways that in reality undermine, and even in some cases might worsen nutritional outcomes for some members of the households. And such decision-making, in fact, what these decisions do is disguise the additional processes of social reproduction that are crucial for the survival of poor households. Another problem in relation to this, what we can think of as concealed labor. Not all gendered labor is concealed, but a lot of labor that is related to social reproduction is disguised in many ways. And I think it's crucial for us to pay attention and to kind of try to surface that in the data that we are collecting. So another problem in relation to this concealed labor has to do with there's a predominance of a productivist approach that has tended to devalue reproductive consumption. So in Africa, for instance, women make up way more than half of the agricultural workforce. And in some countries, women are the majority of farmers. but there's a lack of recognition for women as farmers. Again, this is hidden because women are associated with the provisioning of food, not only as growers, but also preparers of food. And, this is taken in cultural terms around the virtues of this. It's taken for granted. There's a cultural value around it in patriarchal societies. But I think the important thing around this is that they end up being viewed almost as non-economic subjects and therefore non-political subjects. So in countries like India, where we see that even when a woman farmer commits suicide, it's not seen as a farmer's suicide. There's this separation that is problematic. And second is the question, and I think Jomo raised this in one of the slides, on the question of nutrition transition. And you presented important data showing changes in malnutrition with shifts in diets and lifestyles. And I think what was interesting for me is that, what the data shows is the highest levels of stunting and micronutrient deficiency is occurring at the lowest levels of agricultural productivity, where per capita incomes are below 1,000 USD. I mean, that in itself is not surprising, but I wonder whether there's something else or something to be said here about our approach to, the peasantry, which remains very central in of course, it's a polarizing debate, the peasant part itself. It's been a sustained debate within the agrarian South network. But, the peasantry is caught between low per capita incomes, but at the same time remains very key in our thinking around sustainable food systems, including any discussion of agroecological sustainability, has to account for this. We are talking about largely agrarian economies. And so this data that you presented suggests, at least on one obvious level, that access to there's a sort of course, predominant focus on agricultural production rather than food production, which is also a distinction Jomo made. And in relation to food production, particularly, the fact that land alone does not automatically translate into well-being. So much more investment is needed in factors that support nutritional sufficiency. And we've seen this, we saw this during the pandemic and even prior to that, that even where subsidies are available, from the state. So for instance, during the COVID pandemic in Africa, where state provision of temporary relief to households, this was through social grants, cash transfers, food parcels. These were necessary, but not sufficient by any means, because millions of households still continue to experience hunger, which of course preceded the pandemic, but they were not enough, these kinds of to tip it in any significant way. And of course, this was in part, I think, was because there was a neglect of the social realms that sustain food production on a daily basis. And of course, this realm is generally neglected in policy. The failure, and I think also that the failure or the insufficiency of state provisioning also suggests that these persistent, the persistently minimal rates state support actually presume other sources of household income. And these are resourced mainly through unpaid gendered labor, which is the devaluation of this labor continues in part through exclusion from official statistical measures and macroeconomic policy. And I think in much of the developing world, we also saw that economic stimulus packages do not account for the structural changes in household income that has taken place over the course of the long course of neoliberalization. Privatization, the reduction in the public wage bill, cuts in public investment, massive job losses, and very significant challenges to or possibilities of formal sector employment. And so in fact, we are currently sitting with a massive population of surplus labor whose consumption needs are tightening this squeeze. And I think the important thing here, and why we have to pay attention to this surplus population, I'll talk about it again in relation to land, is that where we are paying attention to nutrition for children or women, or all these groups, there is a population that has no income and has no land, and there's a very intensified competition or need, or I think more difficult distributional choices around this. And what we are seeing is a dependency on livelihood strategies for income and survival, which now actually cannot, again, wages alone cannot take care of the consumption and livelihood or survival of most of the working class and poor households on the continent, or in Africa specifically, but I think in much of the global South. And what we are seeing is the dependence in many households on wages, on income from petty commodity production, and on subsistence agriculture. So in other words, household production by itself can no longer guarantee the social reproduction. It is also the case that in Africa and throughout much of the agrarian South, all of these different livelihood strategies, whether we're talking of wage labor, petty commodity production, and subsistence agriculture, all of them are now dependent on some kind of access to land and on some kind of access to nature. So we are no longer only, when you're thinking of food and the question of the resources that is needed, we are also, there's a much larger population that is dependent on land and that is dependent on the commons, who are not actually being concretely accounted for in the sort of resources that we need for food sustainability. So the commodification of resources, like water, the commodification of land, of healthcare, of sanitation, of housing, therefore significantly has a significant effect on this reproductive structure of many poor and working class households. The third point I'd like to raise is related to some of what I've spoken about, and is around the need for a deliberate focus on land resources and agrarian reform. this has to be central to how we are thinking about the global food crisis. So for one, the fact that land, large-scale land accumulation, what has been called land grabs in common language, we've seen there's been a steady escalation in the South throughout the neoliberal period. And I think this demonstrates that capital accumulation remains very closely integrated with agriculture. There is an obvious demand for land. And with it, there are two competing visions around this demand. One is a vision around industrialization. Again, this has been theorized by my comrades in the agrarian South. So one is this vision around industrialization, and the other is around the question of survival. And this question of survival can no longer be evaded in the face of the massive attrition of labor from industry and from manufacturing that is ongoing. These people simply have nowhere else to go. There's nowhere to get money, there's no land that they're running to. So there is a very large and growing surplus population who must be placed at the center of our thinking of this global food crisis. And what the data shows us, I think the general trend has been a decline. I think we're seeing this across, a decline of the contribution of agriculture to GDP. This is more dramatic in some areas than other regions. And the prevailing argument, I think the more mainstream argument around this is that this movement, it is this movement away from agriculture that is responsible for the crisis in food security worldwide. But in reality, of course, there is a shift towards greater market orientation at the macro level. And I think this shift is also reflected quite concretely at the micro level. People are increasingly being pushed out of subsistence production into production for the market, which often means moving away from basic food crops to crops for higher income classes. And this trend is reinforced by micro level interventions. So there are always a range of credit delivery programs that, basically pull poor households into market-oriented production. And of course, the neoliberal reorientation of developing, the priorities of developing countries, the reorientation of their priorities.
Can you try to wrap up, Lynn? Yeah, we're running out of time.
I have, maybe I'll take 3 more minutes and I'll stop. A fourth is, or the last thing I'd like to talk about, fourth is around, the global food chain. And I think this has been raised by both Vikas and Jomo. Just the fairly heavy reliance on world markets for food, which has been worsened with the pandemic and with the war. And so, the fact that among our present commitments, among the urgent one facing us is a greater investment in small-scale agriculture and agroecology to support subsistence farmers. Lastly, I would like to highlight some key points on the gender dimension of this social question. We've seen a withdrawal from a food-driven economy or land being used for food, as well as the intensification of inequality. And both of these processes are acutely gendered. As we know, food is political. So, and food is central to political strategies of the state and also of the household. And I think gender dimensions play out in various ways. And also that the agriculture sector in many of our countries I'd say this is the largest employer of women, especially in rural areas. As we've seen a steady moving out of men from the agricultural sector and a movement into more diversified occupations. So, I mean, in all this, at the core of all this is questions of inequity in access to common resources, whether it is water bodies or forests or grazing grounds. These inequities affect the real producers of food, not just women. It's women, it's predominantly women, but also children and men, people who cultivate, people who are involved in casual labor, and especially landless households. So any restrictions of access to the commons, to community resources, are going to have this pervasive effects on the question of food. And all this to say that the possibility of attaining food sovereignty remains mythical without deliberately ceding more control and more power to the real producers of food and those who sustain this social substratum, this social infrastructure of food production in the face of what is actually a very vicious neoliberal assault on our food systems. And I think the ongoing agrarian struggles are more than the obvious indication of the hunger that millions of people are facing, and the agrarian distress is a demand with very many kind of silenced claims and voices in the midst of this. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Lynn. We don't have a lot of time left, but we'll have at least maybe up to half an hour from now. So we'd like to open this up to discussion for anybody who has any questions. I don't see any questions in the English chat. Are there issues being raised among the Chinese listeners?
Number one, you believe that sustainable agriculture does not equal agroecology. Could you please explain a bit more? You said that sustainable agriculture does not equal agroecology. Could you please explain, go to greater details? Could you please explain in greater detail the relationship between the Rockefeller Foundation and food crisis? Question number 3. Climate change has a strong impact on food production. So, are you very pessimistic about the possibility of reversing climate change? Question number 4. Many developing countries would often face food crisis. Does this have anything to do with the land ownership or land regulatory system or land tenure system that has been left by the previous colonial system? Question number 5. During this pandemic, does transnational agribusinesses, big enterprises, have some special strategies to keep their profit? Question number 6. Professor Jomo, during his last session, said that he does not agree with the MMT theory. Could you explain what kind of monetary policy can be employed by governments to improve their own food production? Do you think that should increase their self-sufficiency in terms of food production? Question number 7. Since the beginning of this new Cold War, we have this tendency of deglobalization. So should we go back to the peasant economy and food self-sufficiency so that countries could rely less on import of food? Question number 8. I would like to know the speakers and the discussants' idea on this proposal, on this concept of food sovereignty. Question number 9. We would like to thank Professor Jomo for his speech. We would like to know the relationship between organic farming and the crisis in Sri Lanka. During the 1970s and 1980s, Samir Armin brought up this proposal of de-linking theory and strategy. After listening to Professor Jomo, I see that many developing countries are still in the trap of development where there are hunger and undernutrition or malnutrition with the general public. So how to solve this problem? Question number 10 for Professor Lin. Awesome. If the society recognizes or acknowledges women's identity as farmer, will this bring about any change? Are there any examples? The last one. I agree very much with Professor Lin. Awesome. That we should stick to land reform. But according to China's experience, this has to be accomplished through revolution. So what does the speaker and discussants think?
So over to, I think Lynn has had to, she had an earlier appointment, so she had to leave earlier. But we have Vikas and Jomo around, and I'm sure they can easily handle all these questions. Yeah. And Jomo, just to throw in something else, somebody else from the chat book wants you to address this question of why is there a perception that tropical countries must actually be organized, as agricultural economies rather than industrialized ones. Maybe in the midst of your discussion, you might want to address that as well.
There are many questions and quite different ones, but let me try and take on sustainable agriculture. What's the difference between sustainable agriculture and agroecology? I think there are two fundamental principles of sustainability in agriculture. One is sustainable use of natural resources, and second is sustainable farming practices. That is, farming practices that do not harm the ecology. I think these two are not necessarily in conflict with a certain amount of use of chemical inputs, or even, for example, use of modern technology, or even, for example, use of biological innovations, genetic innovations. These are not necessarily in conflict with scientific innovations of various kinds. When that is not to say that all scientific innovations and technological change cannot be unsustainable. Of course, there are obvious and well-known cases of technological changes that have been ecologically harmful. But you can have scientific and technological solutions integrated into systems of sustainable agriculture. Agroecology necessarily refers to nature-based solutions, natural farming kind of solutions that often exclude solutions developed through the use of modern scientific technologies. So, I think I would stick to the idea of sustainable agriculture, which includes which sets the principles of sustainability, but is more inclusive of solutions developed through the use of modern science. On climate change and food impact, I think it's very useful to look at it from the lens of mitigation and adaptation. Importance of what can be achieved and what should be achieved through mitigating, and who should do the mitigation insofar as climate change is concerned, on whom should lie the burden of bringing about reduction of CO2 emissions. But it's also important, particularly when one looks at things like agriculture and food systems, to look at adaptation. That is, given that a certain level of climate change has taken place, what can be done to minimize its impact on food and agriculture, and in fact on those who are engaged in production of food. And there one needs to then look at who bears the greater burden of its impact, and where should one then focus on minimizing impact. In fact, there are, for example, a lot of interesting possibilities of developing solutions for improving resilience of agriculture, for reducing its vulnerability to floods, reducing its vulnerability to droughts, reducing vulnerability to things like salinity and so on. So I think when one talks about climate change and its impact on food production, one should really think of both mitigation and adaptation, and not think only in terms of mitigation, which is often a mistake made. Well, not just a mistake, is in fact a spin that is often given when one talks of the impact of climate change on agriculture. To what extent our constraints, food crisis, are dependent on land relations imposed by the by the colonial systems? Indeed, they are. I mean, there are, but this would, of course, vary from country to country. Both the kind of sort of impact colonial periods had on land relations, and what has been done to sort of deal with it. So, for example, in the Indian context, there is a sort of a large discussion of the impact of things like zamindari system, a system of absentee landlordism that was imposed by the British, and how the fact that land reforms, the implementation of land reforms have been partial at best, has meant that a lot of those deficiencies have continued, and the land distribution continues to be highly unequal. In fact, this relates to a later question that was posed to Lin about the possibility of land reforms in countries where there has not been a revolution of the kind that China had. Well, I think there are cases where interesting attempts to implement land reforms have been undertaken. I'm talking of contexts where we've not had the kind of revolution, people's revolution that China has had. A good example is for the state of Kerala and the state of West Bengal in India, but I'm sure there are others where you had, let's say, broadly, I mean, even Mexico, for example, where you've had a period of sort of capitalist development, but a period of capitalist development that was sort of preceded by a certain attempt to implement land reforms. That attempt to implement land reforms was partial. It was limited by the fact that it was you didn't have a wider social and economic and political revolution of the kind that could have perhaps resulted in a more comprehensive program of land reforms. But important things have been done in some parts of the world. Deglobalization, should we go back to food self-sufficiency? Should we go to small peasant economy? I think the three things are somewhat different. I mean, what is happening in the name of globalization right now is actually the rich countries sort of creating, sort of getting into a sort of protecting themselves. It's not deglobalization of the kind where the global south is able to protect its interests and is and enforce its sovereign sort of economic policy making. That said, should we go to food self-sufficiency? I think food self-sufficiency is an important goal, particularly for large countries. Food self-sufficiency in production of major food commodities, staples, cereals, pulses, oils, major food commodities, milk, egg and meat. I think importance of enhancing domestic production capacity is extremely important, because particularly for large countries not being self-sufficient, high levels of import dependence for key agricultural commodities results in a situation where you just become a price taker. You depend on something that's very basic, and you compromise your sovereignty if you become dependent on imports of those commodities. That said, should we go back to small peasant economy? That's a whole different question. I think there are economies of scale in agriculture. I don't think we should blindly be glorifying small production. That said, a shift away from small production can only happen as part of a larger process of structural change in the economy, where small producers can be productively absorbed in other sectors of the economy, where they can be provided decent jobs. If the shift from agriculture to non-agricultural economy is of the kind where people are pushed out of agriculture and into precarious non-agricultural employment, that's not the kind of structural change that is desirable. And that kind of structural change would mean impoverishment of poor peasants. So that's a problem. But that said, I do think that there are economies of scale in agriculture, and a process of economic development in which non-agricultural economy grows at a certain pace and is able to absorb labor. You can think of moving to an agricultural system that's based on a larger scale of production through things like cooperatives and some kind of cooperative action. So there are possibilities of that kind that should not be discounted. On organic farming and the crisis in Sri Lanka, yes, I think this sort of sudden blind shift to organic farming without thinking of the macroeconomics of it was a serious problem, and that points us to basic importance of macroeconomics of this. So for example, when you think of shifting from mineral-based fertilizers to organic fertilizers, it's important to do the basic calculation. How much nitrogen do you need? Even with improvements in fertilizer absorption, how much nitrogen, phosphate, and potash do you need? And if it's going to come from organic sources, what are the channels of supply? Do you have access to that level of organic manures that would be enough for you to provide nutrients that you need for maintaining a certain level of production? Now, that's a basic economic calculation that needs to be done. Now, you cannot shift to alternative systems of agricultural production without doing those things. That is not to say that alternatives are not possible, but it's important that these alternatives are rooted in science, the basic economics is taken care of. And if you do that, you should be able to do, so shifting to more sustainable agriculture is possible. But as I said, this has to be based in understanding its scientific basis and understanding its economics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vikas.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Jomo, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much to all the questioners for the very interesting questions. As Vikas said, it's going to be very challenging to try to deal with all these questions in the short time which is available. But I want to thank those who have asked the questions, because these are all very important for a debate on these issues. Let me go through all the questions quickly, even though Vikas has addressed some of them. I think the first one was, of course, the whole question of agroecology, and are they equated with sustainable agriculture? There has been a tendency, as Vikas reminded us, but there has to be a struggle over what is meant by sustainability. And he was very clear about what should be the criteria for sustainability. But if you look at how it is being discussed by Davos and those people, what they mean by sustainability also includes the sustainability of profits for the companies concerned, and they often define and twist sustainability to refer to specific issues. So, for example, by prioritizing the whole question of the use of the surface land, of the land surface for absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, by doing that, they recommend the use of very dangerous herbicides. Okay, so that you don't have to plow the land. All you need to do is to use the herbicides. But for anybody who knows these issues knows that very well, that plowing the land also is very, very important for the ecological sustenance of the land. And in fact, there are alternatives. So the whole question of sustainability often might involve, since we have moved away from shifting or student agriculture, the whole question of sustainability may well involve questions of crop mixing and so on and so forth. And these are all very, very important issues. But there has been a tendency to be reductionist in this discussion about sustainability, and we should resist that. As far as the Rockefeller Foundation is concerned, from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, even 1980s and 90s, the second half of the 20th century, the major organization which was very influential was the Rockefeller Foundation outside of the Soviet Union, the Soviet influenced world, and China, of course. So they basically promoted all kinds of solutions, and they were a very, very important driving force for the so-called first Green Revolution. Okay, so I think that is the Rockefeller Foundation. Now, the Rockefeller Foundation, particularly as far as Africa is concerned, has been overtaken in influence by the Gates Foundation. So the Gates Foundation created this thing called AGRA, and AGRA, except for one country, Rwanda, AGRA has basically failed to significantly increase output, agricultural output, and so on and so forth. So the whole problem of food crisis, and particularly the fact that the transformation of Africa from being a net food exporter up to the 1970s into a net food importer in the last 4 decades, is partly related to a number of changes, including the integration of Africa into international international markets, and also related to the promotion of AGRA, of a particular view of what the Green Revolution should be, and it's one which is heavily reliant on new seeds, which are obviously involve reliance on companies which are providing those seeds, and a number of agrochemical inputs. So how all this relates to the food crisis is not a straightforward issue, but what we have been trying to discuss today. So the third question was on the question of climate change and whether I'm pessimistic about it. Yes, I'm very worried about it. I'm very worried about it because, as the IPCC, the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has projected, the situation is very serious, that we are probably, instead of going for 1.5% Celsius, which is already bad, by the way, especially for tropical countries. It is going to be far worse because the likelihood is that we will reach about 2.8 degrees Celsius. Now, that is a fairly conservative estimate by the IPCC. Some people are even predicting that you go beyond that. And one of the groups in the IPCC, I think it was group number 8, led by a Canadian, basically they argue that beyond a certain beyond a certain level of temperature rise, there are so many feedback loops that you cannot control it at 2.8. So these are the things which we don't really know about. And in many of the temperate countries, I still remember when I first went to work in the UN in 2005, there was a long article in the New York Times talking about the benefits of climate change, that the ice, the Arctic ice would melt, and therefore you can have maritime shipping across the Arctic Circle, and therefore you can cut. You don't even need to build a second Panama to improve the Panama Canal, and so on and so forth. And then the other thing was that the growing season in the temperate countries would basically grow. So it would benefit North America. It would benefit Ukraine and Russia, but at the expense of the rest of the world. So it was always the whole the so-called benefits thing was looked at from the perspective of the temperate countries. It was not looked at in terms of what kind of consequences it would have for the world as a whole. And this kind of thinking, unfortunately, still affects the thinking about taking action as far as climate is concerned. Now, when you think about climate change, when you think about the Kyoto Protocol, which was the first attempt to have some kind of international agreement, the rich countries did not adhere to the Kyoto Protocol. Ever since then, the so-called Paris Agreement and so on, they are not binding agreements. They do not commit governments to do any real things. These are just basically desirable targets which are shared. And the excuse in the rich countries is that, well, we can't really force the companies to do what we want, and therefore we have to allow this kind of thing. So I'm very, very pessimistic about the way things are going. And as you can see, with the Ukraine war and so on and so forth, nobody is even seriously talking about the climatic considerations of climatic consequences of war and so on and so on, which are very, very serious, as people who have been working in this area are well aware. Now, I won't talk about the whole question of the colonial impact on land tenure, but one has to remember that there's no single colonial impact. Even in a large country like India or in Brazil, you have very different size farms. You have large farms, you have small farms, you have farms growing different types of crops, and so on and so forth. So you cannot say that there is a simple direct relationship between colonial impact and land tenure, but certainly the colonial impact, because there have been very little change in land loss since in the post-colonial period in most countries where there was no fundamental land reform. And so as a result, there are consequences, but the consequences are very mixed and are very specific. The next question is about the agribusiness TNCs and how their profit strategy during the pandemic. That's a very good question. Frankly, I have very little idea about what they did during the pandemic. But I think what is happening now, because of the food prices, the propaganda from these agribusiness TNCs is once again going up about the need to increase productivity, basically claiming that the whole problem is not enough productivity because developing countries are very slow to adopt these high yielding seed varieties. They're very slow to adopt agrochemical inputs and so on and so forth. A lot of this is false, but there's not enough time to get into these claims and to debate them here. There is a question on modern monetary theory, which I talked about in the last meeting, and I'm not sure this is the place to talk about them, but I just want to say that my main concern, I just want to repeat my answer last week. My main concern is that modern monetary theory is being interpreted by many people in developing countries to think that there are no constraints on the issue of fiat money, okay? That they can just simply issue currencies. And this is fundamentally wrong. In fact, the US is the exception, because the US enjoys what is called an exorbitant privilege, because people are prepared to buy and hold US dollars, even though they are not the US financial assets, US Treasury bonds do not increase significantly in value. So they are in effect, by holding Treasury bonds, they're actually losing money. But most of the time, they are prepared to accept it because there's a perception of security. So what is happening now, as the US basically sanctions Russia, and there's an implication of a threat to China, in addition to the threats already to Iran and other countries. So there are increasingly many countries which are now preparing for alternatives. Now, which alternative will emerge will be very difficult to tell. Maybe the BRICS might get an act together, but that also is very unlikely given the nature of some of these regimes. So it's very unclear what is likely to happen. But it's now, what are the government policies we can do for increasing food production? I'm sorry, that is basically what we are trying to discuss today. And but there are, of course, no easy solutions. It is very dependent on context and so on, which we need to think about. Now, whether we should celebrate this deglobalization. Well, President Xi Jinping basically went to Davos a few years ago and said, we are now the new standard bearers for globalization. So China is offering a different globalization, okay? But the fact of the matter is, I don't agree that the deglobalization began with the new Cold War. Deglobalization began basically around the turn of the century, not any precise date. It began around the turn of the century, possibly around the time of the Asian financial crisis, but especially around the time of the global financial crisis. Because basically what happened was that you have a lot of countries basically thinking that they can, to protect themselves, they should, I'm talking about rich countries, they should basically reduce their openness to international trade. So not only the US, but increasingly Europe basically backed off from trade liberalization in those days. At the same time, I think it's important to recognize that financial globalization continued. But financial globalization is a very complicated and very uneven phenomenon. So, for example, financial globalization in the US context was used by big corporations to buy out their shareholders and for the principal shareholders to gain greater control. This was shown by Mr. Shin Jang-sub together with William Lazonick in their book, but it's also studied by others. But in Europe, the consequences were different, and likewise with the rest of the world. So I think it's very important for us to recognize that all these processes, whether globalization or deglobalization, whatever you want to call it, are very uneven processes. You can have deglobalization on trade, but enhanced globalization on finance. And even the consequences are quite different in different parts, at different times and so on. Now, as far as food sovereignty is concerned, I think it's very important to recognize that food sovereignty, insofar as it really mobilizes the farmers, is a very desirable movement, because you are trying to empower the farmers. But whether food sovereignty should be seen in terms of food self-sufficiency, is a different question. When you have relatively small economies which are trying to produce a variety of things, it becomes very difficult. So, for example, during the 1960s, Cuba tried to go for increased food self-sufficiency, and then they realized that it was a very problematic transition. So they basically gave up on that and continued to push for greater what do you call it? Sugar cane production, and then eventually they moved into more and more new biological products. Now that's a very long story, but the point is, I think, to pose the whole question in terms of farmers take control and we become nationally self-sufficient in food, I don't think is something which is very realistic from the point of governments, whether they are right-wing governments or more progressive governments. The situation in the world is actually much more difficult as far as this is concerned. Organic farming, I think Vikas basically responded to that very well. But I just want to highlight that why did the last government of Sri Lanka turn to organic farming? They turned to organic farming because they had a foreign exchange crisis. They had no more money to buy fertilizers. So you then announce that no more fertilizers, turn to organic farming. That is the worst way to promote sustainable agriculture. You know, you do not do it in an ordered and a way to ensure an agrarian transition which is likely to succeed. You just basically take it away. So it is like, somebody is walking around and then you say, okay, there's no the boat. Sorry, if you're in the water and the boat is leaking, so you just go in and start swimming, even though you may not know how to swim. This is not the way you do things. So now sometimes progressive governments do this kind of thing. They say, oh, we are when other countries try to sanction them, to isolate them, and so on, they say, oh, let us become self-reliant. Okay, this has happened as far as North Korea is concerned, but it doesn't mean that that is necessarily the best policy. It is a policy where you are trying to make a virtue out of a necessity. A necessity is not a conscious choice, but you have no alternative, because if you think of what happened during the Russian Revolution, it is not that Russia wanted to cut off its ties. Basically, the enemies of the Russian Revolution invaded Russia, and basically they had to turn to what was called war communism during that period. So I think we have to recognize that governments adopt certain policies out of necessity, but let us not make it a virtue and claim that this is the way to move to organic farming. It still begs the question of how do you best move towards something which is less ecologically harmful and so on. Now, the question was also raised about Samir Amin's proposal of delinking. Now, I had a lot of discussions with Samir, who was a dear friend, and on this issue, I must say that his own thinking changed over time, and I think there are many other people who are involved in this discussion who can shed much more light on Samir's thinking on this. But I think it is not as simple and straightforward as cutting off your trade relations with the rest of the world. The next, on the question of women's role in society, I think we continue, if we are seriously progressive. I think there was a slogan, Chinese women hold up out of the sky. But we have to really see what this means in many different contexts, and there always has to be an extra effort to try to rectify some of these problems. Now, China does that, for example, as far as minorities are concerned, and likewise, it is important to do this as far as women are concerned. And I think that this kind of special effort to attend to some of the special problems which are faced by women and girls, I want to emphasize, and girls, because girls often have no say and their problems are neglected. Do you need to have a revolution for land reform? Yes and no. You can have a counter-revolution for land reform. This is what you had, for example, in South Korea. Because of what happened in North Korea, the land reform, South Korea had to do something to address the problems of farmer discontent. Similarly in Taiwan, when they, the Kuomintang elite who ran away from mainland China, they had no land in Taiwan. So they were quite happy to reform other people's land. Okay? And that's why the old Taiwanese elite, many of them were pro-Japanese, because they saw the Japanese as protecting their land rights, but the new government in the mainland was threatening their land rights and so on and so forth. So it's complicated situation, but I think the reforms which the Americans promoted, Wolf Ladejinski, which was part of the Rockefeller kind of movement in the 1940s, 1950s, a lot of land reforms were done in particular circumstances by regimes to protect themselves. So even the Shah of Iran, for example, had a land reform. So regimes do land reforms, but they are reforms of a different type from the kinds of reforms which you do in revolutionary circumstances. But you also have situations where progressive regimes may not do all the reforms which they need, because they recognize that the revolutions they have launched are not really socialist revolutions. They are national democratic revolutions where they need to continue to get the support of all the people in order to make progress. So then the last point which Francis Lowe raised was the question of the tropics and agriculture. Now, I think it's important to realize, if we look at the population of the world, before colonialism and so on, you find that there were far more people living around the tropics. It was much easier to live in the tropics because of the conditions, the climatic and related conditions in the tropics. The best soils were around the tropics. And so you have much higher population densities around tropics. If you take, for example, the Yangtze River, okay, the route south of the Yangtze River was supposed to be the rice producers, the rice eaters, and north of the Yangtze is supposed to be the wheat eaters. Now this is of course a very crude caricature, but I think it is important to recognize that you obviously don't grow wheat in the tropics, but you can grow rice is certainly much more conducive to tropical environments. So the sustainability, the so-called carrying capacity of land in the tropics was much higher. So you have much more dense population. And Arthur Lewis, who was an economist from the Caribbean, he pointed out many years ago that the terms of trade was biased. Just like people like Singer and Prebish and so on showed that there was a bias in favor of manufactured goods against primary commodities. Arthur Lewis showed that there was a bias against tropical commodities compared to temperate commodities. And this is a very important insight. It is related to the fact that there were a lot more people in the tropical areas as well. And this it relates to his idea of a so-called theory of growth and so on and so forth. But the point I'm trying to make is that it's important to recognize that the carrying capacity in the tropical zones were much higher until the settlements of the more recent period in the temperate places like Australia and the New World in North America and so on and so forth. So this is something which is very important. And so when you have global warming is not equal in impact. It is hitting the tropics much harder. It is hitting developing countries who are mainly in the tropics much harder as a consequence. So I think it is very important for us to recognize that there is an ecological basis for some of these problems as well. And in this case, it is the tropical ecology, which is of course different from the temperate ecology. Of course, there are many gradations, and it's not a simple, straightforward thing. But I think it is very important to recognize that this kind of difference, and to recognize that the agriculture is that global warming is making tropical agriculture very less and less sustainable. This is also a problem which we need to think about. I once had the opportunity to fly over the Sahara Desert during the daytime. And when I looked down, you could see that once upon a time in the Sahara Desert, there were many river basins. You can actually see the remnants of it because of water which is still in the soil, allowing a certain amount of growth to grow in that soil. So it's a very, so you begin to realize that all this has happened within the last few thousand years, and so, and the Sahara Desert is growing. Many other deserts are growing. What were once tropical grasslands are becoming arid grasslands. Arid grasslands are on the verge, at the edge of deserts, and deserts are growing. Only in certain places, like the Gobi Desert, has there been a relatively successful efforts at reversing that. Likewise with Muammar Gaddafi, when he tried to have his so-called what is it called, not green revolution, but green something or other, when he tried to reverse by taking water from below the sands of the Sahara to try to green the Sahara once again. But those are very exceptional. In the vast majority of the world, throughout the Sahel, the Sahara Desert continues to expand, and this is very, very dangerous. This is part of the reason why you have a lot of political instability, but to make that connection is a much more complicated thing, which I won't get into because I think we are already running out of time. So let me stop there. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and thank you all for your patience.
Thank you, Jomo, for, I'm sure everybody is, as grateful to him as I am for this, wonderful evening that together with him and Vikas and Lin.